Hi, I want to take a few minutes today to talk you through some of your initial tasks for Project 3, the literature review, to give you an example of how you can start thinking through the research that you're doing for this assignment and then prepare you to write about that initial research and start to think about the connections that you're seeing between texts. Project 3, the literature review, is about discovering and writing about what researchers and scholars have said already about the topic that you're thinking about researching for or developing a research plan for your research proposal. This is really the first step in writing a research project, is seeing what's been done before so that you can respond then in your research and writing to the scholarly conversation that's happening around that topic. Blog 4, that's due at the end of this week, is about getting you started taking those initial steps in the research process to start to put text in conversation. So we want to move from thinking about research just as a task of accumulating text, but of really starting to think about how they speak to each other and of how you will respond to that conversation as you move to join that conversation. Your reading this week is bound up primarily in reviewing texts that you've used for research so far, some that you've looked at or uncovered, identifying the texts that you think are key or foundational for your research project. And then there's also one other text that I'm asking you to read by Stuart Green, and you can find this in the readings folder. Green's text is about helping students or thinking about how students can discover connections between reading and writing. And one point that I want to pull out just right now is this on page 156, where he says, "It follows that we can help students develop a set of tools in order to locate the context or situation that shapes the production of a text, determine the rhetorical structure that influences the way readers interpret a text, and determine the kind of language that is appropriate to a given rhetorical situation." And he goes on to talk and give an example of how you, as a student researcher, might look at some of the texts that you're using for your research project, not just to read them for content, but to do what we read about in the Wadsworth Guide the other week, do some rhetorical reading where you understand how the text is structured, why the research came about the way it did, how the author has chosen to put different texts in conversation with each other to their own ends. So those are some of the moves that you should be thinking about as you read, in addition to the focused reading that you're doing, where you're looking just for the information that will help you answer your research question and position your study that you'll develop in Project 4. So here we are in the Week 6 folder. A couple reminders on the activities. You're watching the video right now. I reminded you about Green's mining text and reading to write, and then spoke briefly about how you will read or reread what are called launch texts for the research project. Again, at least two foundational texts for the project, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment, and then start to skim and review texts discovered in research that you will get into much more over the next week or so. You also have a task of watching this video, Why and How to Give an Ignite Talk, which is something to preview for Project 3B. I will give you more explicit directions on that in next week's video. But you could also read that assignment description to get some information on it. You have this task here to conduct library research based on your research questions, and you'll need to do that in conjunction with writing Blog 4. Remember to use the library databases, especially those in the research guides in your field, as they will give you more focused results on your topic. For example, when I am looking at texts on education, I like to use an ERIC search, ERIC, because those are resources that are written in education journals. Then toward the end of this week, what I would suggest you do is kind of write blog 4 as you go throughout the week. You're going to be working on bringing together a bunch of that information. Blog 4 won't be something that you can just sit down and write all of a sudden. You need to be doing it as you're conducting your research. So I want to show you a quick example of how I would start to put together that blog. And let's start by looking at the directions. So I have a note on here. As you compose this blog post, you'll begin working through the research process for Project 3A, the literature review. And your first goal here is to secure 1 or 2 core sources or launch texts that significantly address your research questions. So 1 or 2 foundational texts that are at the center of the information you're trying to find. In your post, you're going to cite and briefly summarize those texts or that single text, and then work to identify keywords, helpful footnotes, and citations in those texts that could drive your further research, so things that you think are important. And you're going to list what seems especially helpful. So let's pause right there in the directions and take a quick look at an example. The thing that I'm going to start with on blog 4, and this will probably be easier once I have thought more about which of my research question possibilities are going to be the most productive or fruitful, and I'll be giving you some feedback on those earlier this week. The research question that I'm working on, and this is actually one that I'm working on for a conference paper right now, is what is gained by thinking about silence as a rhetorical responsibility rather than a rhetorical tool or possibility. Those of you that learned about argument in English 1020 can see here that I am working on developing a definition argument. What happens when I frame silence as responsibility instead of as a rhetorical tool? So this is a question that I'm interested for a number of scholarly reasons. And 2 texts that I've been looking at in relationship to this question are Cheryl Glenn's 2004 Unspoken, A Rhetoric of Silence, and Krista Ratcliffe's Rhetorical Listening, Identification, Gender, and Whiteness. These are both long texts, full-length books, not articles. You might consider using full books for your research project, bearing in mind that you don't always have to read the entire text. Oftentimes, the introduction and 1 chapter that are focused on your research question will be sufficient for your research. So I'm going to list those both as my launch text. Now, something I still have to work on. I've written longer summaries in other places as I'm working on this research project. If I'm going to keep working on blog 4, I need to move those summaries here and kind of get them down to 3 or 4 sentences. What is the real meat of what these writers are saying about rhetoric and silence? The next thing that I described was I want to start keeping track of some useful keywords, footnotes, or citations. Now, I've just started working on this blog post. I haven't gotten totally all the way through it yet, but some texts or some keywords that I've identified as important that I want to keep thinking of. Glenn cites invitational rhetoric, which I've written about in my notes. Ratcliffe's term, rhetorical listening, is a keyword that pops up in a lot of scholarship. A lot of people have taken up her discussion of that in their own scholarship. And then she also uses the phrase responsibility logic, and I want to think about that. Now, as I continue working on this blog, I want to move into some of their other notes and citations. So I look at their works cited entries, see who they're referencing in their scholarship as well. When I go back to the blog instructions, I can see this next step. This is where I get a little bit more exploratory. So I'm going to continue to build answers by forging a research path using these keywords, footnotes, and citations gleaned from my launch text. I'm going to follow this research path through at least 5 iterations or move for a total of 6 texts. So I've already done one of those by moving from Glenn's text into Ratcliffe's. Now she talks about Ratcliffe or references her in her text. And then using these tools, the keywords, the footnotes, and the citations, I'm going to identify at least 5 more texts. Noting in the blog the key ideas and topics covered in these texts, and highlighting again keywords and arguments that I see standing out in each of them. Okay, so I've done, like I said, just a little bit of this so far. From looking at Glenn and Ratcliffe's texts, I've come up with a few more based on an ERIC search that I conducted. For each of these, I want to list not just the citation to keep track of it, because I'll be doing a really deep reading of these in the next week, and I probably want to start that this week. But I also want to just list briefly the key ideas or topics that each one of them is covering. So, actually, this first text is not one that I took from either one of their works cited entries because it's written much later, but you can see that Glenn and Ratcliffe eventually, I believe it's from 2011, worked on editing a longer text on silence and listening as rhetorical arts. I came across that in some of my initial research on the topic. So I got that edited collection from Purdy Kresge Library, and one chapter in it is by Sherry Stenberg, and she writes about cultivating listening, teaching from a restored logos. One of my research interests is not just thinking about silence and rhetorical responsibility, but thinking about how that translates into the composition classroom. So Sherry Stenberg's text helps me look specifically at that. And then for my other experiences, I want to look at Marilyn Cooper's Rhetorical Agency as Emergent and Enacted, because that's one of the texts that I cited in my dissertation when I started thinking about framing rhetorical responsibility. But the ERIC search that I conducted today gave me a couple other texts that I want to start looking at for this project. And that includes Candace Spiegelman's Taboo Topics and the Rhetoric of Silence, where she is writing about, at least the title tells me she's writing about Lives on the Boundary, which is by author Mike Rose in a basic writing class. And so I can predict that she's writing about that as a key example. What happened when her students were assigned to talk about this text? And having skimmed Sherry Stenberg's text, I know she also looks at or discusses students' responses to particular texts in their class. So that might be one of the key connections that I start to pay attention to, is how does silence relate to students' responses to text in class. Another text that came up that I want to take a look at is this text by Peter Kaufman, Teaching Note, Gaining Voice Through Silence. I selected this one from my research note because it's about the teaching angle particularly, and that's something that I want to think about. So as I start to review these texts this week, I at least want to begin listing some key ideas and topics for each of them. The last direction in the blog 4 is to start to note any key connections, differences, or questions that I'm seeing. So I've pulled here some examples of things that I've noticed just as I've worked through Glenn and Ratcliffe. I just mentioned a few connections that I'm seeing between texts as I start to skim these 4 additional texts that I'm going to look at. So this blog 4 really serves as a heavy-duty focused brainstorming tool. Not just starting to think like, what might I like to write about and why, but finding texts that I'm going to investigate more deeply over the coming weeks as I start to think about the connections between them and developing a study that responds to these conversations that already exist in my field in rhetoric and composition on the topic. One other thing that you might notice in the directions for blog 4 is that I suggest that you have at least 300 words. Right now in this draft that I'm making here, and I'm going to just copy and paste this into the blog post. I'm not going to upload a document. You can go either way. But right here, I'm at 418 words, and I still have to include my 3 to 4 sentence summaries of Glenn and Ratcliffe, and then 3 or 4 sentences on the key ideas and topics of these other 4 texts. And I might list more useful keywords, footnotes, and citations as I continue to brainstorm. So, there should be plenty for you to write about and brainstorm. And hopefully this is a text that you can come back to and that I can come back to with you as we continue to work through your literature reviews.